Hello, everyone, and welcome to the presentation of the Culturally Responsive Teaching Track. My name is Keasha Starks. I'm currently the manager of Equity and Access, and today I'm really going to talk about how we can authentically validate and affirm our African and African American students. Now, with this track, yes, it does talk about our African and African American students, but it also talks about how it can be beneficial to all students. So I'm really going to talk about how this track has come to pass, but also what is the benefits of taking this track as a teacher as we show up in front of our students. Now, as I stated, yes, my name is Keasha Starks, manager of Equity and Access. And as I begin to talk about, us authentically validating and affirming our students, I want to talk about my why. And I really want you to reach into your why as well. My why is my three beautiful children. And they do show up as African American students or African American women in society today. So my why is really trying to unpack what it is to validate and affirm students, but not just the students, but also the adults. So the track that I'm going to talk about today is really centered around you, but also how does this permeate to our students as well. So we're really going to align ourselves with the district strategic plan currently that we have until we get our new one, and then I'll align ourselves with that as well. So we really want to make sure that we are being authentic in our classroom and creating those safe environments through being culturally responsive and through our racial narratives as well. So we're really trying to understand how we show up in our spaces and how we engage with individuals. So we are really working off of our vision and our mission statements, the new ones that we did receive. So I'm just going to give you a few moments to read over this and kind of acclimate yourself with our mission and vision statement. So we do see you, whether it's your racial makeup or it's your cultural navigation or your cultural norms and how you present yourself and engage with others. So we really want to, as a school district here in Palm Beach County, want to educate, affirm, and inspire each student in an equity embedded school system. And we can do that through being culturally responsive and culturally competent. So we are also going to address our equity policy that we do have and had for maybe about 2 years now, maybe a little over. But we really are looking at how to interrupt and dismantle those harmful and inequitable practices and policies that we have as a system, but also eliminate that implicit and explicit bias. And we'll talk about that more as I go into this track. We also want to create those truly inclusive, responsive, culturally responsive environments for all, not just the students, but for the adults as well, because we do show up culturally different as well. We want to ensure that each child receives what they need when they need it to develop their full potential, whether it's academic or that social realm. But I'm also going to put us back into that, right? Because if we're not successful if we don't get what we need to be successful. So I put you all right back in there as adult learners. And then we want to cultivate those unique gifts, talents, and interests that reside in every child. And again, I put you right back into that because you do have gifts, talents, and interests that reside in you as well. And some of us got into this education because of those talents and interests and gifts that we do have. So we're going to try to bring that back to the forefront with being culturally competent of the individuals that sit in front of us in our classrooms. So what to expect in these courses? They are full day. So we do have 6 courses within this teacher track. So it starts with Introduction to Culturally Responsive Teaching, goes into Let's Talk Courageously, Awareness of Implicit and Explicit Bias, Identifying and Processing Trauma, Pedagogy of Culturally Responsive Teaching, Creating Learning Environments for Equitable Outcomes. And we are going to talk about each one of these as I proceed through the presentation. So we do have pre and post assignments, I do apologize. But we do have pre and post assignments. Now this was done by design. The pre assignments are really just to get you acclimated into the content that we're about to get, that we're going to dig into when you get into those courses. And then the post assignments is really just for us to see whether you are processing and understanding how to go through this equity walk and journey through the work that we continue to do. There is a possibility of earning 72 points once you complete all 6 courses. You will have a seal. If you see the seal right there at the top of your screen, you will receive the seal once you receive all 72 points of your in-service points, and you will register through e-learning. Now, you will not be automatically registered through e-learning, but you will be able to register for each course through e-learning. So let me explain again these courses through e-learning. They are prerequisites of each other, and there is a 45 delay between the courses. Now, you will not be able to enroll or register for the next course until your current course is closed and complete. But I will explain that through the courses and through the sessions that you have with me if there are any questions regarding that. So, Introduction to Culturally Responsive Teaching. So I look at this as kind of like the fun course. This is the course session where you can get strategies and ideas that you can implement into your classroom the very next day. So this is kind of the fun course. Sometimes we get into some really, really deep conversations based off of our experiences when it comes to being in the classrooms. But we really want to learn those principles and tenets of being culturally responsive with our students. We also want to learn the elements of culturally responsive environments with those classrooms. We also want to assess the culturally responsiveness of our instructional practices. How do we assess that? What are we supposed to look at when we're looking at this? Then we also want to discuss how to implement these CRT strategies for our students. And what does that authentically look like in our classrooms as we're being culturally responsive and culturally competent at the same time? So I am going to show this short video of what culturally responsive teaching looks like in its totality, but also what are the benefits of this?
Hello and welcome to Teachings in Education, Strategies for Culturally Responsive Teaching. How can teachers create a more inclusive environment? First off, teachers should get to know their students. This means knowing more about them than their academic strengths and weaknesses, but getting to know them on a personal level. Next, have high academic expectations for all students. Too often, teachers for some reason believe that ESL students aren't capable of learning because of their language barrier. This does a disservice to them. Provide opportunities for these students to speak English. The more opportunities and practice students have to speak English, the better they will become in speaking English. Encourage students to try their best in speaking. Display some of your students' culture in the classroom. For example, if you teach a classroom with mostly African American students, have up some posters of individuals such as Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. Continuing, incorporate visuals into your lessons. Communication can get distorted between various cultures. However, there can be no confusion when everyone in the classroom is viewing the same thing. Incorporate a multicultural curriculum. This includes teaching from a curriculum that represents the cultural history of the students, and it highlights the most effective teaching methods. Hear your students' stories. Provide assignments such as culture studies where students can talk about their cultures and about themselves to the entire classroom. Next, work to build relationships with parents of your students. The research is out there. Parents of ESL students are not as involved as typical parents. And the last strategy, which is often overlooked, is to get your students' names right. That means being able to pronounce their names, because when you mispronounce their names, they get the feeling that you don't actually care about them. Right now, I would like to say thank you for your time, subscribe to this channel, and like and share this video as well. See you again very soon.
So being culturally responsive is a gamut of things. It's understanding how to pronounce your students' names, to what should be on your wall with the population that is sitting in front of you. So it's really understanding how to engage with your students, but also understand how they show up and how you can build that relationship with them as well. And that includes with stuff on your walls or stuff that is around your classroom as well. So then we go into the second part, which is course 2, Let's Talk Courageously. And in this course, I'm looking at developing your skill, your knowledge, and capacity to bring racial equity lens to our collective work, personal, professional, and organizational focus regarding equity and cultural and racial norms and cultural norms and all of those things that follow that gamut. Provide time for self-reflection and discussion. So I'm big on processing. I'm big on reflecting. What worked? What didn't work? Is that something that I can continue doing? And then increase knowledge of self, others, race, culture, and bias. So in order to even dismantle a lot of the things that I talked about with our equity policy, we have to be self-reflective of others. We have to increase our knowledge of not only ourselves, but the people we come in contact with on a daily basis, whether that's the biases that we carry with us, or whether it's the cultural distortions that we see, or maybe it's that racial social construct that we continue to elevate ourselves with whenever we are engaging through our different spheres. Now, when we talk about our racial norms, this course is really to talk about, or really to unpack, how you see yourself racially. How do you see yourself culturally? What were the conversations that you had as a young child or as an adult that kind of, circled around the conversation of race or sexual orientation or any of those things? How comfortable are we having these conversations? So I really unpack how to have these conversations, but also what is your level of competency in these, or self-efficacy or self-confidence in having these conversations. So we really look at, to what degree are you conscious of the impact of race on your life? And do you see that it impacts you? And if it doesn't, what is your engagement with individuals who do actually, have that impact of race on their life? And is their perspectives being shared between those individuals who have those different views? Now, when we get into course 3 is really, sometimes it's the harder of the sessions, because this is really putting your own biases in front of you, whether they're implicit, where you don't know you're doing it consciously, or they're explicit, whether you know that you're doing it and you know that you're saying it. So this course is really to get you to understand what implicit and explicit bias means and how it may influence our decisions on a daily basis. Also to understand that being implicitly does not necessarily mean that we act in explicitly ways. So you can be showing your bias, but that does not mean that you are aware of it, which means that you are not aware that you are explicitly showing these. So we really dig deep into what our biases is, how can we, or biases are, and how can we really navigate ourselves and understand what our biases are so we can change that narrative. Then learn to recognize some behaviors that suggest bias or different treatment. So I really talk and walk us through decision-making processes that really allows the lens of our bias. Am I just tired and I'm just going to go along with the social construct? Or am I really asking myself, is this equitable? Does it fall in line with my values? Or am I just making this decision because I'm tired? So in course 3, we really unpack how your biases show up. We look at microaggressions that are also tied within the classroom. So when we look at biases, it's disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing. Now, this is usually in a closed-minded or prejudicial mindset, and it's usually unfair all the time, some unfair. Biases can be innate or learned. People may develop these biases against an individual, a group, or a belief. In science and engineering, a bias is a systematic error. So keep in mind, when we talk about a systematic error, your brain has learned how to see things, right? So if you see a chair and you've been taught that that's a chair, your brain automatically goes to a chair. But your biases work off of the same thing. And I do explain how and what are some of those examples. And you'll hear one of the examples that I use a lot is the white vans, working vans, not the shoe vans, but the working vans. I do have a bias behind those. There is a belief behind that. And that belief is, and I don't know if anybody else was exposed to the PSAs in PE class. I know I'm probably telling my age right now, but that is okay. But we were taught as young people that those were called kidnappers vans. And do I know that there's some successful people behind those vans? Absolutely. But I do have a bias, right? Because of the science behind it, because of the belief behind it, that bias is still there, even to this day, because it is perpetuating itself through what the normal is now. Human trafficking is huge these days. So I'm still very vigilant of what those vans may be or where they are within my realm of perception. So when we talk about overt, conscious belief in superiority of a group, now this is one thing that we saw in some of the individuals that were taking part of the insurrection, where we saw the men with the T-shirts on. That is, a sign of someone believing that they are a superiority over another group. So that's overt bias. Now we have explicit bias. That's conscious belief that some groups aspire to have those traits more than others. So we have that explicit bias where you just may not like a group of individuals based off of what you may be hearing, what you may have been taught, and what we have been socially constructed to believe as we navigate into society. And that can come from TV, it can come from music, it can come from the things that we listen to, the things that we surround ourselves with can create those implicit biases within our engagements. Now you also have or experience maybe some implicit bias. This is the unconscious association regarding some groups or ideas or beliefs, so you don't know that you're doing it. And this is where a lot of us fall short, as when we don't want to offend people, we implicitly bias them. And because we are implicitly doing it, we don't know that we're doing it. So the phrase or the question, "Where are you from?" that is a microaggression. That is a bias. Because I do not look like you, you're automatically looking at me as if I'm not from here. So you ask me where I'm from. So by asking that, you are alluding that I am not from here because I do look different. And that is part of the grander scale of micro and macroaggressions. So biases are the seeds of microaggressions, for a lack of a better word. But I want you to take notice of how huge this is. There's so many pieces to this, and a lot of times we don't even realize that we are doing some of these things because we have been socially constructed to navigate ourselves and engage ourselves with these individuals, including myself. I've had to do a lot of pruning, and if you are following me on Twitter or if you have taken some of the courses already, you will notice that I call this a journey because it is such a pruning process to really understand how we show up, but understanding how we show up comes from the experiences that we have collected over the years. So the macroaggression system. Now, this is your structural violence. This is your historical or current oppression. So let's think about how things have been set up. Let's look at our history, how some things are not being told in our history books. Things are being omitted. So this is that structural violence, right? This is that historical and current oppression. That is an example of what that aggression is. Now, when we look at microaggressions on the individualized level, because we can tear these out, it's just not one blanket of microaggressions. There are tiers to this. So you may have a micro insult, you may have a micro assault, and a micro invalidation. And we go through and we unpack all of these to the aspect that we really put in, or I put in front of you, what are some of those microaggressions that we have within the classroom? Because we really need to understand that our microaggressions are things that we say that we don't necessarily think that are offensive or harmful to individuals. So here are some examples of what some microaggressions are, or who is affected by microaggressions. So a lot of people will possibly say that, yeah, this is for more Black or brown. This is for everyone. I mean, everybody is being affected with microaggressions and this type of bias. You have your race and your ethnicity. That's always going to be number one. That's kind of what we kind of were built off of with this country, is having those racial divisions. Class, social economic class. There is some microaggressions and some macroaggressions with that. And we unpack what those things look like. Gender. We do have some gender biases that are still going on, and some microaggressions that are possibly happening every single day, and not just in society and outside world, but also within our own four walls, within our career as well. Religion. That is another component that is getting a lot of that anti-Semitism, and a lot of people having things to say about the different religions that are coming into play. But if we're really going to be equitable and culturally competent, we need to take into the concept that everybody is going to have something different. We just have to respect their space that they are currently in. Sexual orientation. It is Pride Month. Very excited for that. But we also need to keep in mind that they are targets for microaggressions and biases and stereotypes and all of those as well. So we really have to put them within that bucket of the biases and microaggressions as well. And then ability. Whether you're an able-bodied person or you have a disability, there are some microaggressions and some stereotypes and some biases that go with them as well. We don't have the Disabilities Act just for nothing. So we really want to unpack what that looks like in the classrooms, as well as what it looks like in society as a whole. Now, this leads up into the trauma piece. Now, when we look at trauma, it's identifying and processing trauma through a cultural lens. So we're really trying to look at how each culture navigates their trauma, but it's really important to understand that everybody experiences trauma. Identify what childhood trauma is and the possible events that may cause those traumatic reactions. Understand trauma and identify self-care strategies to use in our daily lives. We got to start helping our students to cope. We know how to cope as adults. We've navigated, whether we've been taught or we taught ourselves. But how are we being role models with our students and teaching them how to cope with a lot of things that are coming down the pike? COVID, we got a lot of COVID. We got a lot of racial unrest that's all spewing all over TV, all over social media. So how do we bring that into where the students can actually have a conversation or understand what it is that their bodies are going through when it comes to the trauma that they are being exposed to? And that includes yourself as well. How does trauma affect people? There are effects to this that our body automatically, out of our control, works to protect us in those aspects. But also, there are some effects that come about with trauma that is not healthy, and we go through those as well. Why is understanding trauma important? Well, we're in our classrooms. We really need to understand what our students are coming to us with. Things at home may not be peaches and creams. We may have some domestic violence. We may have some neglect. We may have some other underlying issues, some homelessness, some job losses. COVID has been a huge traumatic piece for not just our lower quartile communities, but even some of our higher quartile as well. So we really have to get into the gamut of understanding trauma and how it affects individuals, whether that's collective or whether that's on an individualized scale. Understanding how past trauma can be triggered by experiences in the present. So even in my learning, I understood, or I started to understand, that my past traumas was dictating how I engaged with individuals, which was really eye-opening because I did not realize that the things that I experienced past was assisting me with how I responded to individuals currently. And that was because of the triggers that we see with ourselves and how we navigate ourselves within those spaces. Now, when we talk about trauma, we want to also talk about and unpack where trauma takes place. Now, I want you to kind of peruse through this just a little bit and kind of see which one surprises you the most. Is it one, household? Is it two, community? Or is it three, the environment? I know when I looked at this, the environment really, really struck me like moon phases. Moon phases affects the current or the rotation, which is really interesting because if your body is connected to the energy levels of Earth, then whenever there is a full moon and the tides are high, your personality may be off, depending on how you are connecting to the universe or how you are connecting to the Earth on its own. But I thought that was really, eye-opening, but also educational, because I never realized that that could be a traumatizing experience. But I knew that, natural disasters, hurricanes, I mean, that traumatizes me. Hurricane Steel, and I've been living in Florida for 20 something years, experienced those hurricanes in North Carolina too when I lived there, snowstorms in Germany. So really understanding that those incidents kind of impacted me on a level that had me engaging with individuals a lot different. So this is just something that we really unpack in the training, because I want us to understand that our traumatizing events happen all over the place, and they can happen daily, because what is traumatizing to one person may not necessarily be traumatizing to the next person, as well as the impact of the trauma, right? What's traumatic to me may be slightly traumatic to me, maybe just a little bit, but to the next person sitting next to me, that event could be huge and major for them. So it's really important just to understand how people are showing up, because we never know what's going on in individuals' lives as they come into our spaces. We're really just here to make sure that we are kind to them and that we give them the best experience that we possibly can within their schooling years. Now, here are some triggers that I was talking to and referring to before. Now, this was really interesting to me as I embedded myself in my own triggers and trying to unpack myself to be ready for this work. These were some triggers that I kind of was looking at like, whoa, okay, I didn't understand how a person could be a trigger, but it makes sense. If there's a person who comes across your past that may have done some harm to you, and someone resembles them or smells like them, that could be a trigger. A place. Think about the place or the places that you were traumatized. Would you go back to them if you had an option? Or if you had a choice, would you go back to that place, right? So places could be triggers. Things could be triggers. A particular clothing, a particular color of that clothing. Smell. Think about colognes or perfumes or cigarette breath, or any of those things could be triggers for or from traumatic events. Smoke, not smoke, but outside, the inhalation of smoke. All of those could be triggers when we are talking about students who are coming to us. Sound and noises. Think about that. I know with me, my own trigger, one of my triggers is the loud noises. I am, a lot of times my children say I overreact, but I'm starting to unpack that that's possibly one of the triggers that I have from a traumatic event in my life. So I'm currently trying to unpack that now and not be so skittish around those things, but that is a trigger. Touch could be a trigger. Time of year could be a trigger. Being yelled at, which happens to be one of my triggers. And that can cause people to shut down. So think about the students who are sitting in front of us that we may yell at or that we may scream at. And a lot of us have done it on some levels, including myself. Think about how that could have been traumatizing to any student. And I had to even unpack myself in that and be honest with myself and reflect and kind of say, okay, you don't like it, so why would you do it to someone else? So really just unpacking how we see ourselves and how we engage in ourselves. Textures, dates, all of that could be triggering for individuals. Birthdays, holidays could be triggering for individuals. We just really need to be mindful. And I say that because we do a lot of holiday activities in classrooms, and I want us to be mindful that sometimes these holidays can be triggering for some of our students, especially now with students coming back and having lost loved ones due to COVID. I now am experiencing or having conversations with assistant principal colleagues from various counties, and that's one of the things that they are concerned about is students coming back and having tremendous loss in their life. Whether it's, a father or it's a grandfather or it's an auntie or uncle or, a cousin, just really realizing how people are showing up, especially after the pandemic, not after the pandemic, but after coming back from being shut down and coming back to brick and mortar. So this is really, really important to understand. The triggers not helps, but it kind of dictates how we engage with individuals. And I really think it's important that we need to understand what our triggers are, so we can engage with people on a different level. So now that we unpack our traumas, our biases, our racial and cultural narratives, and then really looking at, the introduction of culturally responsive teaching, we go into the pedagogy aspects of culturally responsive teaching. And what is that supposed to look like now that we understand how individuals are showing up or may be showing up to us? So learning about our students, interviewing students to see what it is that they like and don't like, really giving them student voice in your classroom. How would you have liked this to be taught? What are their learning styles? Looking up multiple intelligence and giving them those surveys so that you can understand how to develop lesson plans that are really geared around the cultural population that's in front of you. This gives the buy-in, but it also gives the students the chance to see that you are embedding them in the content and you're making it relevant to them. Integrate relevant word problems in any classroom, and that could be sentences too, that could be literature, it could be social studies. Just make sure that the integration of the content is relevant to the students and relevant to the population that you are currently serving in your classroom. Present new concepts by using student vocabulary. Check to see what your students are using. There is an activity that I show within the first course where we go through a continuum, a vocabulary continuum, where we look at the academic word, we look at the culturally responsive word, and then we look at the responsive word, and then we look at the culturally responsive word. Normally, the culturally responsive word is like the slang. It's like their language that, it teaches us what it is and how they see the academic word that we're trying to teach them. So this brings in that student vocabulary within the classroom, but it also gives us as teachers to learn some of the lingo, like drip. Drip is your clothing that you're wearing. That means you're on point. There was a teacher who shared that she learned that from her students, and now every time she says it, the student's like, what? How do you know about that? Just having those authentic conversations with your students and bringing them into the classroom so you can show that this is a partnership and not a dictatorship within the classroom. Bring in guest speakers. If you have a topic at hand, bring in a guest speaker. Reach out to the community at large that they may live in or that they may not live in. Maybe it may be something that the students are interested in, an occupation or a career, and you find a lesson that talks about that. Bring that guest speaker in so the students can ask those clarifying questions, but also note and see that you are reaching out beyond your sphere to bring in those things that will add to their value of education. Deliver different forms of content through learning stations. So this is where I brought in the multiple intelligence. We use centers, it's the same thing as stations, but being purposeful in how you bring those centers out. So in my classroom, we had a cultural station. So every now and then I would mix it up. I would look at, get some input from the students' culture, their heritage, maybe their parents. So, like me, I have two races of parents. My mom's white, my dad's black. But, even having two of those things coming into the classroom, really speaking about their experience, really values or it validates and affirms the students as you bring them into the classroom. And then gamify lessons. So I was a Jeopardy person, so I did bring Jeopardy into my classroom, but even bringing those dry erase boards, and we talk about this in the course. What are some of those games that you can bring in? The Kahoots, the full body games that you could bring into the classroom where the students may be answering, saying A, and then they're going like B, just bringing different things in the classroom so they're not just sitting. And in one video I show it talks about the chalk and talk way. That's just sitting in a seat in your rows and having students look and listen to you. Really bring the students in, having those group activities, having that group work, and bringing it in whole totality so we are touching and reaching each student. And then call on each student. So I know some people do the popsicle sticks or randomizing your students. When you do the popsicle sticks, make sure you put the popsicle stick back in so the student doesn't say, oh, she's not gonna call on me again, so I'm good. I don't need to pay attention to no. Nope, put that popsicle stick back in there. But look and do some of that research. There are some great ideas on Pinterest as well of how to call on each student, but also randomizing that at the same time. That brings in student engagement, but it also makes them accountable for what they are learning within their classroom as well. And then we go into course 6. So course 6 is creating learning environments for equitable outcomes. So this is really teaching how to bring these learning outcomes into the classroom. So mind the data. What is your data saying within your school? And not just your school. What is it saying particularly just in your classroom? Look at your data. Look at how your students are performing. Look how they're not performing. Is it something that they're doing? Is it something that I'm doing? Always in that reflective mode to see how you can help the students become better at engaging in their content and their learning goals. Encourage a culturally responsive teaching. So we really talk about, and again, culturally responsive teaching is also our evaluation tool. If you were to go into Marzano and go into our DQs and do those little drop-down menus, you'll see culturally responsive teaching is really our evaluation in how we should be proceeding in our classrooms in bringing the whole child to the content, but also the learning styles or into the learning room as well. Focus and practice. Focus on practice, not beliefs. So again, when we go into the whole bias, unpacking your beliefs, unpacking those stereotypes. Why? Because we have to unlearn what we were taught. What we were taught was the social constructs that society wanted us to bend to. And what did we do? We bend to it, not realizing that we have bended to it. So really looking at how to focus on our practices, because that's what we steadfast in, right? That's our values. That's what we steadfast in. That's what we anchor ourselves is in our practices, not necessarily our beliefs, but also keep in mind, if you do have certain beliefs about certain things, our workplace is not the place to bring them in there. This is where we should be bringing our students in and not bringing ourselves in. Do we have opinions? Do we have thoughts and ideas? Absolutely. But let's not put those on the students. Let's have them come to their own through our critical thinking and our critical work that we do. Mitigate teacher biases. We have to look at our biases. I know I had a lot of them. I had to reprogram my house, people. I had to reprogram my house because of the things that I learned outside in society and sometimes even through my friends. So I really had to unpack how I was showing up in my teacher biases and how was that even showing up in my classroom and in the outside world as well. And then address those disparities in discipline. So I really encourage people to look at how they discipline. And are you looking at individuals through the lens of your cultural norms? Or are we looking at the lens in which the student shows up or which the person shows up? Which technically means, are we looking at them through our lens or through their lens? 9 times out of 10, 7 times out of 10, we are looking at them through our lens. Ooh, I wouldn't do that. Oh, that's just not right. But what if in their culture, that was the norm? Now we just passed judgment on them, not really understanding or knowing what their cultural or racial norms are. So really addressing those disparities in discipline, but looking at how do we see that discipline? Who's getting disciplined more often? Who is not? Do we often see ourselves calling on or rectifying a student before we even know the full story? So how are we actually navigating ourselves? And how can we truly, truly create those equitable outcomes within our school? So I hope to see you within the track of culturally responsive teaching. I do have a culturally responsive leadership track, and I'll go through that really quick, just so you can understand that the leaders within our school district are taking optional, but they are taking the opportunity to embed themselves into work that is very similar to yours. So their track is almost identical to yours. So their first one is Let's Talk Courageously, which is your second, really unpacking them racially and culturally. Then they go into the microaggressions and biases, really knowing what that is. And I do show them the microaggressions that happen in the classroom as well. Then they go into the trauma piece as well. Now, keep in mind, all of these pieces and sessions is really to unpack you. But as we start to unpack ourselves, we really start to realize that it's also the students that are feeling this way. So if I'm feeling this way as an adult, as the teacher, how are my students feeling as young people still trying to navigate who they are, where they're going, what they're doing, how they're doing it, who they're doing it with, right? We can navigate that, but our students are still looking to us to model how that should be done authentically and healthy. So they go through the trauma piece as well. And then we follow up with how, now that we know what all this looks like, how can we be equitable, diversified, and equitable within our strategies and treatments, not just to faculty, but students, parents, and community at large, or all stakeholders within the classroom. Now, then they go into, so their last course is culturally responsive leadership strategies. So I really focus on, now that we know what 1 through 4 is, now how can we be culturally competent in how we lead through these strategies? So we really go through some simulations. We go through how to implement certain things, how to have this type of conversation. And it's across the board. It's with staff, and that could be from staff to staff. It could be staff to student. It could be staff to parent. Likewise, student to admin, student to teacher. And it could be parent to admin and parent to teacher. But it, just creating that full circle. So not only is our students getting what they need to be successful, but we're also getting what we need to be successful as well. So please follow us on Twitter. We do put out a lot of good news regarding what we're doing, what we're not doing within the equity and access department, but with just equity work altogether. What does it look like? How can you get yourself involved? What are some of the things that we are doing wholeheartedly when it comes to equity? So please follow us on those sites to get some of those updates of what we are doing. So here's my contact information. You can email me. The only ask that I have is that you give me 2 to 5 business days to respond. I do try to respond to every single email, but please be patient with me as I'm in trainings and presentations and meetings, and sometimes I cannot get back to your email as quickly as possible. So please give me that 2 to 5 business days in responding to your email. If you do have a question, you can call the work or cell line. If you have an immediate response, you need an immediate response, you can text that work line. I do respond fairly quickly to text. It's easier when I'm in meetings to respond to a text than it is to respond to an email. So I hope to see you in the track with culturally responsive teaching. Here is my culturally responsive way of saying thank you for even just stopping by to have a conversation with me, or just to see what we're doing here in the Palm Beach District with our students and with our staff. Can't wait to see you. The course that you would be looking at in e-learning is Culturally Responsive Teaching, the Introduction to Culturally Responsive Teaching. You will see one of 6 courses. That would be the course with me. There are other culturally responsive teaching courses that kind of tier off of me, but I am the track for culturally responsive teaching. So until I see you, my name is Keasha Starks, and I'm excited to see you in the upcoming sessions. Have a great one.